I want to talk to you tonight about who God sees. Who God sees. You ever heard this saying, hindsight is 20/20? Hindsight is 20/20. Now, what hindsight is 20/20 means is that you can always see what you should have done better once you're on the other side of it, right? Once you make a decision, you get to go on the other side of it, and you can say, I should have done that different. Like you do something with your hair, and you think, boy, that did not work out how I thought, right? It's not a problem for me, right? You just shave it once a week, and then you're good to go. Hair's easy because it grows back most of the time, right? Well, I'm guessing for most of you, like me in your life at some point, you've thought, man, I wish I could know the future. I wish I could know what was going to happen to me in like 5 years or 7 years or 10 years. Wish I knew who I was going to marry, what I'm going to be doing, where I'm going to be living. And if you believe that God created us, and hearing you guys worship, a lot of you know the Lord, obviously. If you believe in a God that created us, you probably think, I wish I could know what God knows. And why doesn't God, if he's so nice and good, why doesn't he just tell me all of it, like right now? That would be handy. Thanks, Lord. Then I wouldn't have to worry about doing the wrong thing because God would have already told me what the right thing to do was. And I believe with all my heart that the answer is because if he did, it would freak us out and we'd run the other way. If he's like, here's what you're going to be doing in 15 years, you'd run the other way. If God had told me when I was 25, he's like, listen, when you get married and everything, it's going to be awesome, but your first kid's going to be a 13-year-old girl. You're going to be married about a year. She's going to come live with you. It's going to be fine. I would have been like, I'm not so sure about this plan you have, Lord. But I never change it in a million zillion years. Christine will tell you, every night we prayed with her. I would say, Lord, thank you. She's our daughter. We're her parents. So God made it to be that way. But I wouldn't have chosen it. And if I had known, I might have sabotaged it. I believe what God does do, though, is he prepares us for what is coming. Even if we're not aware that that's what he is doing in the moment. And I believe, someone mentioned this tonight, I believe God's heart towards us is kind. He walks us into things and as gently as we need to be walked into them, as long as we are listening. God's kind no matter what, but he walks us into stuff when we listen. A great example I thought of is when you take kids to a new thing, right? You take them on a plane, maybe, for example. Now, we've gotten to take our little guys on a plane a couple times. I think I did one plane trip. It was just me by myself with them, and that was fun. We took a lot of toys, and it was all good. That's just what we did. We played with toys the whole way. But the thing is, if a kid just thinks about a plane, my sons who are like 3, 4, 5 years old, and a plane is a metal tube with wings that flies overhead, right? I mean, if you just break it down to something simple, it sounds kind of freaky. So what you do is you start, if you don't want it to be a crazy freak out when you're going to go on the plane, you start talking to them about it in advance, right? Hey, John 4, hey, bud. That's what we call him, John 4, because we don't get the Johns confused. So, hey, John 4, bud, we're going to go on a plane. Isn't it going to be fun? Oh, it's going to be scary, Dad. Oh, bud, it's fine. See that one up there? They never crash. It's the safest form of transportation in the world, right? You tell them all these things, and you just tell them, hey, we're going to get on the plane. The pilot will probably be nice to you, let you see in the cockpit. They give you soda, right? You just prepare them for it as best you can. And then when they walk into it, it's still freaky when they go up in the air and the pressure changes in their ears and, the ground goes far away. It's still scary, but if you prepared them for it, they have a better chance of getting through. And I'd say that if we're wanting to find out who God sees, that there is value in understanding what God is doing and listening to his voice each day. Allowing him to prepare us. And if you want to know who God sees today, well, he sees you. And he sees me, right? He sees us in this place, in this room today. Twin Falls, Idaho, 2023. As crazy as it sounds. We're going to talk tonight the story of David in 1 Samuel chapter 16. Awesome that you read 1 Samuel earlier. If you want to turn there, look it up on your device, however you want to do it. We're going to read out of it, and it's right before the most famous part of the story of David. Now, of course, we talk about David, we immediately think of one of the most famous stories in the entire Bible, right? David and Goliath. Or maybe if you grew up in the church, you might remember it better as, what's it called? Dave and the Giant Pickle, right? That's like one chapter later, 1 Samuel 17. Today we're going to be 1 Samuel chapter 16, if you want to get it ready. In 1 Samuel 16, it talks about the anointing of David as the king of Israel. And there's this incredible aspect of this passage that I believe it pertains to you guys as young people. And there's a couple things we got to know to set up the story. One of those is that when what we're about to read is happening, Saul is the king of Israel. He was the first king of Israel. And before Saul became king, Israel was this group of tribes who had their own judge. They had no king, they had the group of tribes, and the judges did it. There was nobody in charge of the entire nation except God himself. And that's the way that God set it up. And as 1 Samuel begins, like she was reading, the prophet Samuel is born, we can see that the nation of Israel, they're doing fine at first, but eventually they're not in great shape spiritually. So just the big zoomed out version, the priesthood, the people running the nation, they became corrupt because they're humans. If you go back and read it, you can see an example with the sons of Eli in chapter 2. These sons of Eli, they started mocking the sacrifices to God that the people were bringing, and they were just eating whatever they saw fit. Here's what 2 Samuel 2:12 says. Now the sons of Eli were scoundrels who had no respect for the Lord. Anytime the Bible calls you a scoundrel, that's not where you want to be. Right? At this time, this is the Ark of the Covenant, which carried the presence of the Lord. It wasn't at the tabernacle where it was supposed to be. Anybody ever seen the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark? Yeah, a few of you. It might be before some of your time. But that's the thing that he goes and touches at the end, the Ark of the Covenant. His eyes like come out of his head and all that stuff. During the first part of the book, the Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines. It doesn't really go well for the Philistines when they have it. Like crazy, weird things start happening to them. So they're just like, here, take this thing back. We don't want it anymore. But the Israelites, man, they're messed up. They're given to worshiping idols. Chapter 7 specifically says they've begun to worship foreign gods. The judges themselves have become dishonest. Chapter 8 talks about how they start to take bribes and they didn't value justice anymore. Basically, my wife would say it was a hot mess. So when it goes like sideways like this, she says that's a hot mess. Samuel, though, he's a good man and he followed the Lord. And God was using Samuel to bring the nation back to him. And the Israelites, they had seen the nations all around them, one of them being the Philistines, who Goliath was a part of. They had an earthly king, and they began clamoring to be just like those nations. And God tells them in chapter 8, it's not going to be as great as you think, you guys. It looks awesome, but it's not going to be as good as you think. But he tells Samuel to grant their request anyway. He says, Samuel, go ahead. These people don't know what they really want, but sure, grant them a king. And this guy Saul is fine at first, but he begins to be disobedient to God. And eventually, after repeated chances, God rejects Saul as king of Israel. In this time, chapters 1 through 15, the Israelites, they're continually battling the Philistines, and it's not going well. They're serving other gods, little g gods, not the big G, real God. They're being harassed by opposing armies at every side, but in chapter 16, it's time to choose a new king. That's where we pick up the story. 1 Samuel 16. Whoops. That's just my bookmark. 1 Samuel 16. Our main text today, we're going to be 1 Samuel 16, 1 through 13. I'm going to read it to you out of the New Living Translation. I think we have it on the screen. Follow along. Your subtitle probably says something like, Samuel anoints David as king. Let's read together. And the Lord said to Samuel, you have mourned long enough for Saul. I've rejected him as king of Israel, so fill your flask with olive oil and go to Bethlehem. Find a man named Jesse who lives there, for I have selected one of his sons to be my king. But Samuel asked, how can I do that? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me. Take a heifer with you, the Lord replied, and say that you have come to make a sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you which of his sons to anoint for me. So Samuel did as the Lord instructed. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town came trembling to meet him. What's wrong? They asked. Do you come in peace? Yes, Samuel replied. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Purify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. Then Samuel performed the purification rite for Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice too. When they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, surely this is the Lord's anointed. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse took his son Abinadab to step forward and walk in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, this is not the one the Lord has chosen. Next, Jesse summoned Shemiah, but Samuel said, neither is this the one the Lord has chosen. In the same way, all 7 of Jesse's sons were presented to Samuel, but Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Now Samuel asked, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse replied, "but he's out in the fields watching the sheep and goats." "Send for him at once," Samuel said. "We will not sit down to eat until he arrives." So Jesse sent for him. He was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes. And the Lord said, "This is the one, anoint him." So as David stood there among his brothers, Samuel took the flask of olive oil he had brought and anointed David with the oil. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. And Samuel returned to Ramah. You can see at the end of this that Samuel, he's anointed David as the next king. We're going to look at this for a minute from 3 different perspectives, from Samuel's perspective, from Jesse's, who is David's father, and from David's himself. There's something kind of crazy about this, and that is that God sent Samuel to Jesse knowing full well that David wasn't there. You think God didn't know? Like he sent Samuel there and he's like, "Oh shoot, made a mistake. Forgot that David wasn't there yet." God totally knew that David was not there. God sent Samuel to Jesse's house to anoint this specific teenager as king, but of course, God knew that David wasn't even there. Why would he do that? God is, of course, the maker of the universe. We believe he created these people, the world in which they live. So why did he send Samuel there at that time? And I believe it's because God saw something in that house that day that they did not see. Both Samuel's perspective and Jesse's perspective needed to be adjusted, and that David himself needed preparing. So let's just look tonight at what each one of them might have seen in that situation, what Samuel, Jesse, and finally David saw. Specifically, though, who God saw. First little point I have for you is this: Samuel saw 7 sons, but God saw 8. You even saw him go through the list there, right? I've just got to say it right at the top. If you are a student here, young person here, feels like you've been forgotten, like no one's ever noticed you, maybe they did at first, but they don't anymore, your life doesn't matter, no matter how terribly you do or how well you ever do, no one's going to notice. All of this that we're talking about tonight is for you. Samuel saw 7 sons, but God saw 8. Here's that question. Again, why did God send Samuel to Jesse's house when the one he was looking for was not even there? And I believe it was simply because, and we saw it in the scripture, because God wanted Samuel to measure a different way. It's kind of like when you are moving stuff in and out of your house. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward to move stuff. Sometimes it's not. Any of you ever volunteered to help somebody move before? Anyone ever, when you're asked to move, you come up with an excuse immediately because you hate moving? Yeah, thank you for being honest. That's what I'm tempted to do every time. I hate moving. It's the worst thing in the world. Even if you're moving to an awesome place, it's the worst thing in the world. If you're moving next door, it's the worst thing in the world. It's awful. But sometimes when you go to move, and this happened, we just moved from Kuna to Boise, like 15 miles away, and it was the biggest pain in the rear end. And that's the most kind way I can describe it. The house is awesome. It's great to be in Boise, but man, it was a pain. And our house has an upper level and a lower level. And, we had one of these deals where sometimes you go to put stuff in a house. It's real easy, right? There's a living room and there's the kitchen, and you just get it in the door. It's easy to do. Well, this house, you have to go to get to the main room where the TV was going to be. You had to go down the stairs, and there's a door immediately at the bottom. You have to turn right. What we wanted to do was get this couch that has different parts down the stairs and around the corner. And it took us a little while to figure out how in the world we were going to get this couch that's like a couple of different half circles down and around this door. We had to take the feet off, and we had to get multiple people down there, and one guy had to stand with it on top of him while we twirled it around. We eventually took the door off, right? Those of you that have done a lot of moving, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Sometimes you got to look at it a different way if you're going to get the couch in the room where it's supposed to go. Got to measure it a little bit different. And Samuel, at the beginning of chapter 16 here, he takes the information he has, and he tries to move forward with the anointing of the next king. He's got it measured out. Because you see, Samuel, he's done this job before. He was the one that did the anointing of Saul, if you read earlier in chapter 9. He's done this job once before. So to understand exactly what Samuel is looking at, you just got to go back a little bit. 1 Samuel chapter 9, 1 and 2. I think it's up there. It says this. Just go back a little bit. Sorry, this is where my bookmark was. It fell out. 1 Samuel 9, 1 and 2. There was a wealthy, influential man named Kish from the tribe of Benjamin. He was a son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Bechorath, son of Aphiah of the tribe of Benjamin. His son Saul was the most handsome man in Israel, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the land. Jump forward again in chapter 16 that we just read when Samuel looks upon Jesse's sons. And did you catch what it said in chapter 9? Saul was the most handsome man in Israel, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the land. Well, you go forward to chapter 16. Samuel comes. He looks upon Jesse's sons. Samuel comes in and he thinks, it's time to do the old king choosing process. I've got this one. That guy's too short. That's what he would have said to me for sure. That guy's too short. That guy's too ugly. That one's missing a finger. Those guys are all out. When they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, surely this is the Lord's anointed. Samuel had seen that Saul was a head taller than everyone else when he was anointed as king, and Samuel sees, it says here, that Eliab looks impressive. And if you keep reading, you'll see Eliab later leading some of Saul's army in a couple chapters. But Samuel here, he's sensitive enough to hear the Lord's voice. Here's that verse that really started to grab us when we were reading it, verse 7. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Man, college students, young adults, young people in this place, aren't you glad sometimes the Lord does not look at the same things we look at? Like, I'm pretty glad. Because Samuel saw the 7 brothers in front of him, but God saw the 8th brother in the field, the one that they actually didn't even bother to invite to this. What did God see? God saw the one that wasn't even in the room. And Samuel, he comes in, he's measuring the height and the weight of the boys before him, but God was already measuring what was in David's heart. And did you see? I love what God said about the physical attributes that Samuel noticed. He said, don't even look at them. Those things don't matter. The things that you are noticing, they don't matter. So what was that purpose? To circle back around, what's the purpose of God sending Samuel to the house of Jesse to anoint David, even though God knew David wasn't there? Because it gave Samuel the chance, as he had probably done countless times in a life devoted to God, to rely on what God was telling him instead of what his eyes were telling him. And as he went through that process, just him talking to the Lord and Jesse and his boy standing there and him thinking, yep, oh, okay, Lord, this is the guy. It's just like Saul before. This is the tallest one. Oh, wait, it's not him? And then it probably got a little bit awkward because he had to be like, hey, Jesse, you sure there's not any more kids around here? There's times in our journey of faith, if you haven't experienced this yet, you will, when we think that we're walking into a solution. We've got a problem, and we walk into something, and we think we're walking into a solution. But what it really is just a chance to see more clearly what God is looking at. And a lot of times we think it's the end, but it is more likely just the next step. This is what I'm talking about, how you don't get to know the whole plan, because if you did, it probably would freak you out. And this has repercussions for us in our current time. I don't have to tell you, man, we live in a crazy world. When I was in college in 2003, it was crazy. It's much crazier now. And just like Samuel, it is our job to try and be in tune with what God is seeing, even if at first we don't get it. If you feel like you've missed God's voice before, take heart, because his prophet did it here in the Old Testament. And we can ask God, Lord, help me to see what is in someone's heart instead of judging them by their outward appearance. We can say, Lord, help me to see what you might be doing beyond what I see with my own 2 eyes. And we can also ask God for proper perspective on what it is we are facing. Man, no one needs to sugarcoat it. You guys face some unimaginable stuff. We can ask God for the heart to see the 8th son in the field instead of the 7 that are in the room. We can ask God for the solution that we had not considered yet. We can ask God to see things the way that he sees them. And when it comes to us today and that question, who does God see? Well, he sees you. And he sees the solution that you have not realized is there yet. And he also sees how to get you there. He also sees what you need to know right now to get to tomorrow or next week. And you and I might see an obstacle in our life. I've certainly run into lots in my life. You've run into lots in your lives. I'm here to tell you the more responsibility you have, the bigger the obstacles get. Just the way it works. And you might see nothing but the usual imperfect solutions. You got 2 solutions and both of them seem bad. You might be saying, well, hey, you know what? God, I was really going to wait for a person who knows you and really serves you to start dating again. It's been a disaster so far for me. But I was going to wait. But all these jokers I see are the same. So I guess I'll just go ahead and do what I was doing before. See no better solution. Okay, well, I'll do what I was doing before. Lord, I really had my heart set on changing some habits this time. But everything around me is the same. I don't see much chance of changing. So I'll just plow forward. I'll tell you what God sees. God sees as a young person who's called according to his purpose. And that purpose is to be set apart from the world for his glory. If you're going to serve God in the world in which we live, you're going to look different than everybody else. What God saw that day was the 8th son in the field. What God sees today in you is someone who lives a life that they could never, ever imagine. And it's not by your own strength, but by the power of his grace and mercy. Second thing is this: Jesse saw an immediate plan, but God saw an eternal plan. Man, this must have been quite the whirlwind for Jesse, David's father. Even Samuel showing up would have been a massive surprise. You might have been wondering why some of that stuff was in there that we read about them trembling when he showed up. Because as we touched on before, by this time there was some upheaval in the kingdom. Saul continued to do things his way instead of God's way. Just before this, in chapter 15, God had clearly rejected Saul as king. God had used Samuel to convey that message. 2 Samuel 15:35, just before the part we are reading, it tells us, and the Lord was sorry he had ever made Saul king of Israel. 1 Samuel 15:35. The Lord was sorry he had ever made Saul king of Israel. If God gives you something and then says, never mind, I'm sorry I made you that, you're in deep trouble. Saul, he had continued to be increasingly unstable, but more importantly, he was directly disobedient to what God was telling him to do. Specifically, God had given Saul this great victory over their enemy, the Amalekites, but he had given Saul very strict instructions. He said, I'm going to give you this victory, but here's the instructions, 15:3. Now go and completely destroy the entire Amalekite nation, men, women, children, babies, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, and donkeys. And we can pause for a minute because these are big questions you guys ask, and I just want to talk about this tonight, but I just want you to know God's not afraid of your questions. Ask him the biggest ones you can think of. If you wait on him for the answer, he'll answer. But why would God say this? Go wipe an entire nation out. Don't leave anyone or anything alive. Because before Jesus came to earth, God's judgment towards those who harmed his chosen people in the Old Testament, it was swift and total, and it was brutal. And he was using Saul and this army to carry it out. But Saul, he thought better of this plan, and it says in chapter 15, even though God had said to destroy everything, it says in chapter 15, verse 9, Saul and his army spared the king Agag and everything that was good. We just translate that for you. Hey, God, you know that whole plan you gave me about getting the victory and destroying everything? Well, I'm just going to do it a little different. Because there's like really pretty women over here, and there's a lot of gold, and there's a lot of like livestock I could use to eat. So I'm just going to keep some of the best stuff if that's okay with you. And at the end of the chapter, Samuel confronts Saul on this, and he tells him that God has now rejected him as king. And here's the reason why we're going down this small side road, because Saul was supposed to put the king of the Amalekites to death, but since he didn't do it, guess whose job it is? Samuel the prophet. Saul didn't kill who he was supposed to kill, so it's left up to Samuel to put the king of the Amalekites, Agag, to death himself. Turns out being a prophet is a little rougher job than we thought. And this news, it would have spread around the kingdom. So when Samuel shows up in Bethlehem, there would have been some worry. That's why it says in verse 4, Samuel did as the Lord instructed. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town came trembling to meet him. What's wrong? They asked. Do you come in peace? What kind of visit is this, Samuel? Is this like a good visit? Or is this like a you're going to kill somebody because they offended God visit? What kind is this? Did someone have a better idea than God and now you have to stab them? Is this the kind it is? This is quite the turn of events for Jesse and his family, right? But when the prophet shows up and he asks him to consecrate and purify himself and his sons, he's pretty relieved and also excited because he's going to get to present his firstborn. See, Jesse had this immediate plan for his biggest, strongest son to be the king. But God had an eternal plan for the passed over shepherd boy to become a man after his own heart. Not only that, but the one that God had chosen would win one of Israel's greatest victories just a little bit later against Goliath. Jesus himself would come from the line of David. Jesus, who would make the judgment of the nations, as I just seen with the Amalekites, no longer necessary because of his great love and sacrifice. He'd come from the line of David. Jesus, who would bring heaven to earth in the New Testament. Jesus, who is the reason we can worship like we did tonight. Samuel, though, he asked that question of Jesse in verse 11, are these all the sons you have? And Jesse gives the answer that will change the course of the entire nation of Israel. It's kind of what our thing hinges on tonight. The answer he gives there. Verse 11, there is still the youngest. There's still the one that didn't even invite. This is the part that holds so much meaning to me and hopefully for you. You see, Jesse, he wasn't trying to say anything profound, but he did. There's still the youngest son of mine, but he's out with the sheep. And we don't have any indication, I don't believe, that Jesse was doing anything sinful here. He was just doing what everybody did, what they usually did. He was looking at the biggest and strongest. But he didn't even think enough to send for his youngest son. And he says, there is still the youngest. Now, the youngest was currently a humble shepherd who eventually would be the king. The youngest would foreshadow Jesus himself, who would be the ultimate shepherd and king. And Samuel, we saw in those first few verses, right? He's come through his tendency to look first on the outward appearances, and now Jesse has a chance to do the same. And for his part, right, Jesse could have just not mentioned David if he wanted, although I'm sure God would have figured out a way to bring him to the forefront. We've seen already in these Old Testament books that God has a way of getting his purpose done. He's not trying to be dishonest, and Samuel knows that this must be the one. So verse 12 says, send for him, for we will not sit down until he arrives. By sit down, they mean they're not going to have a meal until David gets there. They don't have to literally stand on 2 feet the entire time. So they send someone to get the youngest. Now, aren't you glad that God does not see only outward appearances? That he says they're still the youngest. Aren't you glad that God says, well, there's still the quiet one. There's the one who shrinks into the corner of the room when it gets loud because they think they have nothing to offer. Aren't you glad? There's still the one who always feels alone in a crowded room and they can't make sense of it. There's still the one that's given their heart away too many times and they swear it's not going to happen again and everyone's rolling their eyes, but this time there's purpose behind it. There's still that one. There's still the one got the bad grades, barely survived high school, but they understand now why they struggled, and it's not because they're stupid like all the adults said. There's still that one. There's still the one, he's not charismatic enough, not really polished enough, We're concerned that you're not a good enough speaker to do this. That's the one that was said to me pretty recently, actually. There's still the brokenhearted. It might be their fault. Their heart's broken. It might not be. But there's real brokenness there. But remember, I'm close to the downcast and the brokenhearted. You guys, what God says to you tonight, they're still the youngest. I'm so glad, and I hope you are too, that God sees something different than we see. And what God sent me here tonight to let you know, I believe, is that God does not see you for everything that everyone else says you are. No matter your failure, your mistake, your unfortunate circumstance, the character trait that you wish you could just get rid of and never see again. You are a son or a daughter of the one true King. And he's got a purpose for your life. You might be the youngest and you might be out on the field, but he's got a purpose for your life. So why did God send Samuel to the house of Jesse even though David wasn't there? Because Jesse saw the immediate plan, but God saw the eternal one. Finally, one more thing when it comes to who God sees. David saw the sheep, but God saw a king. David saw the sheep, but God saw a king. Jesse and Samuel now, they've both done their part. Jesse sent for his hard-working youngest son. Samuel was courageous enough to listen to God's voice, wait on the promise that the next king would be in the house. Let's look at verses 11 through 13 once more. Then Samuel asked, "Are these all the sons you have?" "They're still the youngest," Jesse replied. "But he's out in the fields watching the sheep and goats." "Send for him at once," Samuel said. "We will not sit down to eat until he arrives." So Jesse sent for him. He was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes. And the Lord said, "This is the one, anoint him." So as David stood there among his brothers, Samuel took the flask of olive oil he had brought and anointed David with the oil. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day. And then Samuel returned to Ramah. I think it's really important for us to notice that David, he had no idea any of this was going on. There's no texting social media at the time, right? So he's not out in the field and then seeing his brother's Twitter or whatever be like, "Oh, Samuel just showed up." You know what David was doing? He's out hanging out with the sheep. And sheep who are, as you might know, notoriously stupid. Out there with the sheep, he's like, "Oh, Billy the sheep fell in the creek again. Another day when Billy falls in the creek. I guess I'll go drag him out." He probably did get bored and name them all if you're out there by yourself all the time. He's out there, right? We know he's about to kill Goliath in a couple chapters with this sling. He's out there practicing with that sling. He's figuring out which stones work the best for which distance. See if he can get some of them to curve. He's worshiping God with nobody listening but those sheep. But someone comes out, they come running, and they tell David, "Hey, they want you back at the house." And he's like, "Okay, listen, I'm going to leave you here. Watch out for Billy. He falls in the creek every single day. So when you can't find him tomorrow, that's where he is. He can't get a drink without falling in." I don't know if that was really his name. It probably wasn't. I don't think that was the name they had back then. Just made that up. So he goes back, right? And he sees, as soon as Samuel sees David, he knows that he's found who he came for. And God says, "Rise and anoint him, for he is the one." Now understand that oil that Samuel poured on David, it did not do anything magic. It's not like he was not the king and then it poured it on him and revealed that he was the king. Didn't change anything about who he was. Showed everyone else. Didn't change anything about who David was. It just identified God's choice. Who David already was the reason that Samuel anointed him. Notice what it says next. Samuel anointed David in the presence of his brothers. If you have brothers or you've been around brothers, you know how big of a deal this is. You see, the next and the greatest king of Israel, the one whose line Jesus would come from, it wasn't chosen by a popularity contest or any physical characteristic. Instead, it was chosen by God himself. And it was chosen right in front of everyone who thought it was going to be them instead. And the entire time when David is out in the field, he doesn't know it, but God's preparing him for the rest of his life. He's molding David into what we know him as, is a man after God's own heart. And so they bring David in, they anoint him with the oil, and Samuel lays his hands on him and he tells him, you will be the next king of Israel. And he does it right in front of his older brothers. Because when God chooses someone, he knows the exact right time to do it. Guys, what you need to know in the world in which you live, and it's always been this way, it's just more charged now because we all have phones and stuff. These days, all anyone ever tells you is you better put yourself out there. You better make sure people know your name. If you want to accomplish anything, if you want to make any money, you better make sure people know who you are. You better establish your brand. You better get as many followers as you can. None of that by itself is bad. You better tell everyone how great you are so they don't forget about you. Understand that if God has chosen you for something, and he has, but if God's chosen you for something, you don't need to do any of that stuff. Because he'll pick you and he'll anoint you in his time, and he'll do it in front of whoever he wants. God anointed David right in front of his brothers. And God can make you who he wants you to be in front of whoever he wants to. The key is we have to be okay with it being his plan and not our plan. We got to be content with just knowing it's better to trust God, listen for him to speak. And the reason I can say this with confidence about this story is that we never hear about David in the field. He probably thought this, but it's not significant enough to be written down. We never hear about David out there like, man, I can't wait till I get home. I'm going to show my brothers how good I've gotten with this sling. I'm going to whoop them. I'm going to show them how much better than they are. We don't hear about David saying any of that. You know what David's doing? He's out there with Billy. He's like, dang, Billy, stop. Every day, the same creek. David saw the sheep, but God saw a king. So what happens next in the story? We've set it up pretty well. You think now that he's come in, he's left the sheep, Billy and all the other ones, he's left them in the field, right? And you think that he would head straight to the throne. He's been anointed now. The oil has been poured. The next king is chosen. But David, he went away back out to the fields and he was forgotten again. And at that point, if you had asked anybody in Israel who the king was, they would have said Saul. But if you had asked God, he would have said, it's David. And it was God's opinion that held the weight. And even though God had chosen David, there was still more preparing that had to be done. So David, he goes right back out for more preparation. He's practicing that sling. He's playing his harp, figuring out the magical harp chords. More protecting the sheep from wild animals, taking care of, what's his name, Billy. He's not knowing that pretty soon he's going to use that knowledge of which stones he's got the best aim with. He doesn't know he's going to go use that to win one of the biggest victories Israel would ever know. God was obviously with David when he defeated Goliath, but I believe with all my heart, one of the reasons he killed Goliath, the biggest one, is because he had practiced till he could not practice anymore with the sling and the rock. He couldn't miss because he practiced so much. God was preparing him for that moment. He's not knowing that soon he's going to be leading armies, singing those same songs, liberating cities, and he's going to be soothing a king. He's being driven mad by an evil spirit. In fact, you want to know what David's next big job is? It's kind of funny. Look forward, 1 Samuel 16, 14 through 23. The little heading in my Bible says, David serves in Saul's court. This is what David did right after all of this. Now the Spirit of the Lord had left Saul, and the Lord sent a tormenting spirit that filled him with depression and fear. Some of Saul's servants said to him, a tormenting spirit from God is troubling you. Let us find a good musician to play the harp. Whenever the tormenting spirit troubles you, he will play soothing music, and you will soon be well again. All right, Saul said, find me someone who plays well and bring them here. One of the servants said to Saul, one of Jesse's sons from Bethlehem is a talented harp player. Not only that, he is a brave warrior, a man of war, and has good judgment. He's also a fine-looking young man, and the Lord is with him. So Saul sent messengers to Jesse to say, send me your son David, the shepherd. Jesse responded by sending David to Saul, along with a young goat, a donkey loaded with bread, and a wineskin full of wine. So David went to Saul and began serving him. Saul loved David very much, and David became his armor bearer. And then Saul sent word to Jesse asking, please let David remain in my service, for I am very pleased with him. And whenever the tormenting spirit from God troubled Saul, David would play the harp. Then Saul would feel better, and the tormenting spirit would go away. See, before David became king, God had a job for him. His job was to go tend the sheep, and his job was to come play the harp for the very man that he one day would replace. And it sounds all nice in that part we just read, but if you keep reading, that same man, Saul, he would relentlessly try to take David's life over and over again after he kills Goliath. He becomes fearful of him. He realizes people are going to trust David. He tries to kill him. Over and over, David submitted his life to God. Over and over, the world that David could touch and see, that world overlooked him. David saw the sheep, but God saw the king. The band, you guys can get ready. We're going to sing a little bit and just allow the Lord to do what he wants to do. The question is, ultimately, what is it that made David Israel's greatest king? Is it that he, right after this, he would win this unlikely victory over a giant, turn the tide of war over the Philistines? Is it that he was a talented musician? If you've read the Psalms, a lot of those are written by David. And because of how talented he was, he could rally people to his side. I would submit to you that it's not actually any of those things. He was Israel's greatest king because David was a man after God's own heart. And the thing is, that started out in the field. David would have been a man after God's own heart, whether he became king or whether he tended sheep for the rest of his life. David did not know the big plan when he was out there with the sheep night after night. So you want to know who God sees when he sees you. He sees a son or daughter. You might be out in the field still, but he sees a son or daughter. And his hope for us, for me and for you, is simply that we are after his heart a little bit more each day. You know what? Often we start to see what God sees when we start to walk into his plan. Why did God send Samuel to Jesse's house, even though he knew that David wasn't there? It's because Samuel saw 7 sons until he listened to the voice of God. It's because Jesse saw the chance to have his oldest, strongest son be king until Samuel asked that question, are these all the sons you have? It's because David saw the sheep until God chose him to be a king. And if we're asking the question, how do we see who God sees? Well, the answer is that we do what's put right in front of us. We serve him with our whole heart, and then we trust him to reveal the next steps to us. It's like I said at the beginning, I think, you might only get to know the part in front of you, but God knows what you need to get to tomorrow and to next week and the next month. We serve him with our whole heart. We trust him to reveal the next steps to us. And then we marvel at his goodness when we get a little bit of hindsight. I keep saying, as you get older, I sound like an old fart, but as you get older, you begin to see if you can manage to do it step by step, and I sure haven't done it perfectly. But if you submit your life to God, he reveals it to you step by step. I can tell you, I'll just tell you this. So now I pastor a church. I've been there for 2 years. I hope I retire there. But for a long time, people would ask me, are you ever going to pastor your own church? I would say no. I was content being a youth pastor. I was content leading worship. I was content doing anything but that. I just said no over and over and over again. And if I would have known 15 years earlier that was the goal, I didn't want to do that. But here I am because God revealed it to me step by step. And tonight we're going to sing a little bit. Some leaders are going to be up here to pray, and I'm going to be up here to pray as well. And not going to do anything high pressure, but here's what we are going to do. We're going to sing. We'll be up here to pray with you if you want to pray. And here's some things I'd love you to allow God to speak to you about tonight. First thing is this: if there's sin in your life, and you know, as we've been talking tonight, as we've been reading the Word of God, that you need to ask God's forgiveness. There's something in your life that you need to give to the Lord tonight. Maybe today you just need to know Jesus or know him again, simple as that, and that's what the next step is for you, and you feel God tugging on your heart, come find one of us. We'd love to pray with you. Maybe you felt like you've got this limitation on you that other people say limits you. Or maybe conventional wisdom would say that it limits you. Well, you need to know that God made you and he knows all about it. And he's also got a plan to use it in your life. So if you just like to pray for purpose, ask God for the next step. Ask God or have someone pray with you about a part of you that you just wish wasn't like it is. Maybe you need God's help to accept it. And we'd love to pray with you. And along with that, if you feel like you thought you had an idea what was happening in your life, and then one day you woke up and it all went kaboom. You thought you had it figured out, but now you're back in the field. And you're like, what happened to all the king stuff, Lord? I'd encourage you just to seek God and what he might be saying to you tonight. If you want one of us to pray with you, I know anyone that's up here would love to. I'd be glad to pray with you. A song we're going to sing, we sang it earlier about heaven touching this place. We can do that because of Jesus. Because he came to earth, he lived a life with no sin, and he died and he rose again. If you need to commit your life to him tonight for the first time or again, even if it's been 10, 15, 20 times, today can be the day when you stop running. So why don't you close your eyes? We're going to pray quickly. And, we'll give the band a chance to lead us. Lord Jesus, we thank you for tonight. I thank you, Lord, that you know us inside and out. Lord, thank you that you know me inside and out. Lord, you know all my failures, all my mistakes. You know every limitation. Even when I don't understand the reason you made me the way you did. Lord, you do. Lord, for these students that are here tonight, for these young adults, would you help them to know in this moment that you know them deeply. And if they feel far from you, they feel like they haven't heard from you for a long time, Lord, would you let them know tonight that you see them. There's students in this place, Lord, that it's as simple as the fact that they need to come back to you tonight. Pray you'd call their name and they'd hear you clearly. Lord, as we ask you for a touch of heaven, I pray you'd bring it to this place. Students, would you stand if you would, and we're going to sing.